Good evening and welcome to Love in the Time of COVID, Episode 8, live from Grace Church in the Plains, Virginia. Tonight, Dr. Bill Sachs, Emmanuel and Delaplane, and the Reverend Kate Bryant from Leeds and Markham. We're glad to be back with you for a topic that's near and dear to our hearts, especially as pastors. Biblical and pastoral reflections on healing. We selected this topic because healing is on the minds of many people we love in our churches. It's on the minds of many of you. And we're seeing more and more in the news media and in other venues calls for healing. What does it mean to come together in unity? What does it mean to recognize a wound on an individual soul level or on a systemic level? So tonight we want to kind of think through, in terms of sacred scripture and some of our experiences, what healing might look like in these times and in the future. So I'd like to begin with Kate. Your reflections on healing?
Maybe with a prayer?
Oh, yes. This is the second time we've done this. Okay. Okay, for the human family. Oh God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love, and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, now we've had a prayer and a train.
That way I know I'm at Grace.
Yes, that's right.
Well, as Weston said just a moment ago, our divided and polarized nation is in deep, deep need of healing. And Jesus calls us, all of us, to be agents, become agents of that healing. And in reflecting on healing, I realize that the healing arts begin with the practice of asking questions. Even with all the sophisticated technological tools available to medical practitioners today, the healing process still begins with asking some very basic questions. What is your name? How long has this been happening? Has this ever happened before? Are you in any pain? These questions, and some like them, are pretty straightforward, aren't they? Some are even quite routine, but they are essential to proper diagnosis and treatment. In his time, Jesus was known as much for being a healer as he was for being a teacher. And one of the titles given to Jesus is the Great Physician. The Gospels are filled with stories of examples of Jesus healing every manner of disease. And such healings are called miracles. Miracles, a word that means signs. And they're signs that point to God and to God's presence and power. One of Jesus' favorite questions is, "What do you want me to do for you?" If Jesus asked me that question today, my answer would be, "Jesus, I want you to heal our nation. Help me become an agent of that healing." It's no coincidence that the great physician is the great questioner, because healing begins with questions. Some of the questions Jesus asks sound very much like the questions of a modern physician. When Jesus meets a woman who is tormented by demons, he begins by asking the kind of question a physician would ask when first meeting a patient. "What is your name?" When a father brings his son to Jesus, the boy is convulsed with a seizure. Jesus asks the question a physician would ask to aid his diagnosis. "How long has this been going on?" Getting there. Sorry. When a blind man begs Jesus to restore his sight, Jesus applies a salve of saliva to the man's eyes, and then, like a physician removing bandages after surgery, asks the man, "Do you see anything?" Now, in the Bible, there's no neat division between the spiritual and the physical. We're not bodies with spirits, but whole beings. And there's no strict isolation of spiritual and physical illness. And our inner resources, our spiritual resources, can help us fight disease. So it makes sense to me that Jesus, who lived in a unique spiritual communion with God, was able to help those around him tap into those resources. When a blind beggar cries out to Jesus on the road to Jericho, Jesus responds by asking him, "What do you want me to do for you?" Is that just another silly question? I mean, if you're blind, of course you want what most of us would all want, to have your sight restored. Why does Jesus have to ask that question? Most of us have a tendency to assume that we know what another person wants or needs, particularly if that person is dealing with some challenge or some disability. But perhaps what the blind man wants more than anything else is something other than the restoration of his sight. He might respond to Jesus' question by saying, "What I want most is to be reconciled with my Father," or "I want to be able to share my life with someone." One of those, or something else entirely, might be his deepest yearning. You never know unless you ask. So when Jesus asks, "What do you want me to do for you?" he's showing respect for the blind man. He's not presuming to know what he wants. He's asking, and he's listening. It's a way of recognizing that the blind man is not defined by his disability. It's also his way of inviting him into a healing relationship. Jesus asks the same question when he comes upon a blind beggar named Bartimaeus. He's one of the few recipients of Jesus' healing whose names the evangelists let us know. Many people whom Jesus heals, we don't know their names. Bartimaeus shouts at the top of his lungs, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Son of David is one of those titles associated with the Messiah. Bartimaeus wants Jesus to know that even though he's blind, he sees Jesus for who he is. He's making such a racket that people around him try to shut him up. But Bartimaeus keeps shouting his plea, each time with more volume and more urgency. Hearing his name called, Jesus stops, stands still, and says, "Call him here." So Bartimaeus immediately throws off his cloak. I picture him as kind of a basketball player ripping off his warm-up suit when he's been called into the game, and he runs to Jesus. He's probably panting a bit when he hears Jesus ask him, "What do you want me to do for you?" Bartimaeus, the one who already sees that Jesus is the Messiah, asks only for the gift of sight. And Jesus says in response, "Go, your faith has made you well. Your faith has healed you." And sure enough, Bartimaeus' sight is restored, and he follows Jesus. The healing relationship has now turned into a relationship between a teacher and a disciple. What do you want me to do for you? A friend of mine who's a film producer tells me that a variation of that question is in almost every script. Sooner or later, a character will ask of another, "What do you want?" Often the story pivots on that question and how it's answered. Apparently, it's one of Jesus' favorite questions too, because he repeats it in a variety of circumstances. It's striking to me that this would be one of Jesus' favorite questions, because one might expect that the Savior of the world would more likely ask, "Do you want to know what you can do for me?" After all, those in positions of power are used to being served. It's another instance of Jesus upending the usual order of things. He's forever inviting those at the back of the line to come to the front of the line. In his realm, the most exalted position of all is the role of servant. So it's not surprising that Jesus asks the servant's question. What do you want me to do for you?
Kate, thank you for that. And I want to follow up with something that struck me in what you said, if I may.
Of course.
What do you want me to do for you is a question that for some people may not come to mind because not because we're selfish so much, but because we might be afraid or we might not be proximate to someone in order to ask the question, what can I do for you? We're perhaps isolated or blocked from even asking the question. And so I'm wondering, in terms of that question, what can I do for you? What might you say to someone who is asking the question to themselves, perhaps of another or to themselves, but they're afraid. They're simply afraid to take that next step. That question's welling up within them, but they're afraid to even ask.
Yeah, I think my response, Weston, is to begin to engage that person in their story, not assuming that I know, and oftentimes, as you know, all three of us know as priests, sometimes people in need of healing assume that we have some kind of inner gift to be able to discern that from the get-go. And so I think the first thing that I would suggest doing is engaging that person in telling their story, what has brought them to this moment, what their hopes and dreams for change and transformation might be, but to really engage that person in telling his or her story and listening very, very actively and very acutely, and let that person speak and honor that story.
So asking the question then for you, Kate, begins with an intentional form of listening.
Yes.
Healing can't happen if there isn't holy listening or
Indeed.
sacred listening that is intent on understanding the other.
Yeah. And in line with that, envisioning the whole encounter as a very sacred moment, a very sacred encounter. It is engaging in holy listening.
Thank you. And Bill, reflections on healing, kind of opening reflections, stirring up in you.
Thank you, Weston. Healing needs to be understood as the driving force of Christianity. And by healing, we don't mean necessarily curing disease. Healing is not necessarily a cure. There certainly have been and are those who claim to practice true Christianity by being able to offer instantaneous healing to people who suffer from chronic and painful disease. But what healing really means throughout the history of Christianity, and I believe especially now, is the restoration of relationships. And that can occur for people who do suffer chronic ailments. That, in that sense, healing can occur as someone is approaching death. And certainly in that sense, I think of healing at this time in the life of our nation, not in terms of physical ailments, but in terms of the political and social ailments that beset us, with alienation and division being acute at this moment. The examples of healings, and Kate has given a great one, and citing these questions that really do launch the process of healing. In my own homework for this evening, I looked first at the stories of Jesus healing lepers in the New Testament, stories that are prominent and repeated in several of the Gospels. Leprosy was and is a disfiguring disease, and those who suffered from leprosy in biblical times were assumed to have sinned in some way, and therefore to have brought the illness upon themselves, and therefore were to be shunned as people who were impure. When Jesus heals the lepers, and we assume from reading the stories that this healing indeed represents miraculous cure, and we should never exclude the miraculous because all of us have seen it. But while the miraculous remains unpredictable, imponderable, what is predictable in the stories of Jesus, especially with those who suffered leprosy, is that they could be restored to society. They became acceptable, and they felt a sense of wholeness and acceptance that had eluded them. So in these my opening thoughts, I want to emphasize that healing, which pertains not simply to physical illness, but to mental illness and mental preoccupations, but also pertains to political and social struggles. Healing inevitably means a turn toward restored relationships with wholeness.
Well, Bill, when you talk about restoration, it really is impactful to me because in the criminal justice system, we often talk about moving from a punitive form of justice, Brian Stevenson being one of the foremost examples, whom we met in Richmond once,
Right.
to restorative justice.
Right.
Moving from punitive to restorative.
Right.
But this notion of restoration is tricky, at least for me, because in our broader culture, we're seeing this movement to restore things to the way that they were, to not just make the country great again or make the church great again, but to somehow restore it to some original state in which a wound was not present or some rupture did not occur. And I think that goes for a lot of interest groups and tribes. You know, not just the ones we may be conjuring up in our mind at this moment. Do you have some thought about that?
Thank you, I do. Yeah. The word restoration, and I use it here in the biblical sense. The presumption is those who suffered leprosy, and they are the stories of those who are possessed by demons. The presumption is that they possessed, in the biblical sense, an inherent goodness and wholeness that has been disrupted, disfigured. And so in that sense, the restoration is to a sense of original wholeness and integrity. You know, going back to the creation story in Genesis, where God created the earth and it was good. Mm-hmm. So each of us as human beings in the biblical sense, we are seen by the Bible as inherently good. But something has entered, whether by our own actions or by other sorts of circumstances, something has entered to disrupt the relationship and even to disfigure it. And so in this sense, restoration is a return to a God-given wholeness and integrity and goodness, not the return to some prior social status. In this sense, the healed individual is sent by Jesus to a priest, that is a priest of the temple in Jerusalem, told to present himself, because now he can be taken as cleansed, as cured. And in that sense, the biblical notion of restoration is a misnomer, because it actually pertains to the creation of new relationships, a status that did not exist before. And Kate, you put your finger on it. The doorway to that in these stories and for us is to invite people to tell their stories in ways that we hear non-judgmentally, but simply accept. You know, that's what we do in our ministries. We go to people in crisis with one or another kind of struggle, and we invite people to tell their stories, because their presumption is we will hear their stories without the kind of judgment they would encounter elsewhere. And in fact, hopefully, upon hearing the stories, we will find ways to stand with them in the midst of their struggles. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, restoration is a misnomer, because it's not going back toward, it's going forward to something that has not previously been attained.
A kind of what we call in baptism an anamnesis,
Yes.
or a putting back together as we move forward in a present time.
Right.
Interesting.
Yes.
I'd like to focus on something, Bill and Kate, that you have spoken about in terms of healing. But healing, for me, means that there was something that needs to be healed. It assumes that there is some kind of wound. And when I think of a wound, and I was coming into the church earlier, I was looking at our holy table, our high altar behind me. And on Maundy Thursday, often after the service is over, I invite people to come to the altar and to place their hand over the surface of the high altar and to locate and to touch the wounds on God's body, the wounds that are on the high altar. And I usually invite inquirers classes to do the same when we're going over liturgical theology. But that's a powerful symbol to me, that the wound in Jesus' side from a spear, from which water poured out, the wounds on a hand, and the wounds on Jesus' feet mean a whole lot for any one of us, I think, who have been wounded in some way. And I'm concerned, I guess as a minister these days, that we haven't fully understood the depth and scope of the woundedness that white American folk religion, I'm not talking about Christianity, I mean white American folk religion, has maybe done to our souls. And the notion that, Robert Jones from PRRI and plenty of others who've done decades of research trying to help us disentangle a construct that he calls whiteness, that many folks have called whiteness, and folk religion, white American folk religion, from a faith movement that is all nations, all tribes, all languages, from the day of Pentecost forward, from Luke Acts forward, that was inherently pluralistic in the Mediterranean world, was inherently inclusive and transformational. What, in your estimation, and for both of you, Kate and Bill, is a wound that you might see not in Christianity, a pluralistic, multicultural, global expression of faith, but in terms of white American folk religion? You know, if that is something you believe in, you might not believe there's a wound at the heart of that movement. White American folk religion, of which, for me at least, it's hard to separate that out completely from, you know, mainline Christianity or from other streams of Christianity in our country in some ways. It's hard to tease those things out.
Well, there is a folk religion. There has always been a folk religion. It goes back to the rise of the media, radio first, and then television, and then cable television, and to all sorts of individuals, some with credentials, some with no credentials at all, but who in effect entered the religious marketplace and could find an audience. And the message often had to do with personal salvation. The message often had to do with fantastic promises, even of great amassing immediate great wealth, if one would simply walk the straight and narrow path. But it also, that kind of phenomenon has also, maybe especially in the South, has also had a very tribal, that's an appropriate word, white, blue collar especially, element, and became wrapped up with opposition to the civil rights movement, and then opposition to a sense of social elites, whether white, black, whatever particularly as, and I don't want to stray too far into history or urban development, but as the South grew economically in cities like Atlanta and Nashville, grew explosively with population. And as the South became more integrated into the rest of the United States socially and commercially, there were those who felt left behind and who felt that somehow they had lost control of the world they felt was theirs. And so in that sense, to speak of a need for healing and to speak of wounds has to do with a perception of being shunted aside. And it's not just in the South, it's in cities in the Rust Belt in the United States where plants closed and jobs went away. And, you know, there's a lot of hurt. And whatever one thinks of that politically, as a Christian and a priest, I have to take seriously and respectfully the feeling of hurt that anyone presents to me. It may not make sense to me, but that's irrelevant. I have an obligation as a Christian and a priest to listen to, respond to, and be respectful of any sort of hurt that a person brings to me. And of course, that extends into more immediate circumstances of ruptured relationships, ruptured family relationships. And the scars linger. I'll tell a quick story. We have a little dog we got as a rescue dog. Her name is Lola, and she's wonderful. But we think she must have been treated very poorly wherever and whenever. We got her from an animal shelter in the Richmond area. She was at first very, very shy and timid, and there's still, sometimes if she's in the car and a big van drives by, she will start barking and growling at the van. I mean, there are images that remain in her dog brain of being mistreated. Mm-hmm. And there's a human counterpart to that as well.
Mm. Thank you.
Yeah, to leverage off that, I think there's some social and demographic changes that have happened over the past 2 generations that contribute to people's need or willingness to access religion through TV. And those changes include, 2 generations ago, the father, typically of a family, worked for the same company for 30 years. The family lived in the same town for many years. People's sense of identity was grounded in where they lived, the community where they lived, and participated in that community's life, the place where the father worked. And now, of course, the opposite is true. It's very rare that you have a parishioner who's worked at the same company for 30 years. A number of our parishioners are divorced and have stepchildren and step-grandchildren. And the things that used to help define us are gone. And so, in some senses, our sense of identity comes from what car we drive. Of course, we've been marketed this way. What car we drive, what brands of jeans we wear, perhaps even what face mask brand we wear these days.
That's right.
But the notion, what strikes me about that folk religion is its accessibility. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't appear to make demands on the consumer of that religion, making it harder for some people, say not familiar with the Episcopal Church, to understand, for example, the way we honor tradition in the Episcopal Church.
That's right.
So we can be, especially for those who are not familiar with our denomination, perhaps a little less accessible than what I might call popular religion.
Mm. In terms of healing and getting back to this notion of a wound and those marks on the body of Jesus and the marks on our altar and on many altars, perhaps at Emmanuel and Leeds, I'm not sure if there are marks on your altars.
Not so much.
Here it's simply a symbol of the body of Jesus. And again, when I'm around that altar, I'm very cognizant usually, back when we were celebrating Eucharist, of this symbol, this symbolic act of when we raise up the body and symbolically break God's body. Some liturgical theologians would say that that is a remembrance of violence or a reenactment of violence that is in part of our story. And is a kind of violence that we see being mimicked when people are chasing status or chasing brand identity, or we're confused about who we are. Could both of you share, maybe a story or a thought about a confused identity that was restored and that wholeness or healing happened from, but there was some original wound or some kind of violence? It doesn't have to do with race necessarily. It could be any kind of wound.
I can remember a situation, a pastoral situation many years ago where a parishioner came to see me, and this was in a large parish, and it was a parishioner with whom I'd had warm but not particularly in-depth connection. And he was a quiet man, and he was nearing retirement, and he was in a profession, and was pretty well known in the community. And he was pretty insistent that he needed to see me. And I could tell he was very upset. I shut the office door. And he said, you know, I'm about to retire. And I was the older of two sons. And my parents really wanted me to do this because I was following in my father's footsteps. And he said, but I'm really sorry I did this. I feel like I wasted my life. Mm. This is not who I am. This is not who I really wanted to be. And he said, in a profound sense, I don't know who I am. And so we ended up meeting a number of times and talking at great length. And I really encouraged him to think about, at a very visceral level, what at this stage in his life interested him. And he was fortunate to have, wasn't wealthy, but fortunate enough to have enough means that he could retire and consider. And two things struck him one day. And he was very gracious to me. He said, I realize that you're really standing with me. And he said, he smiled. He said, I also realized that when I first came to see you, you had no clue what I was going to tell you. I said, no, I had no clue. And he said, I tell you what I really love. I really love trains. And he said, I think maybe we can go on one or two train trips in different parts of the world. Maybe I can save some money and can afford that. But he said, I've got old model trains packed away. He said, I think I'm going to pull them out. He said, I really enjoy my trains, and I think my grandchildren would too. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to get to a later point in one's life and to feel that in a basic way one made a decision that was probably pressured by family, but one acceded to it. Mm. But he had the honesty and the courage, even later in life, to face up to that and to reorient around something that he felt was uniquely his own.
What a lovely story.
Yeah.
That's a lovely story. I want to kind of jump off of that and also talk about what it means to be a priest involved in a healing ministry, and how sometimes, surprisingly, when we think that we're healed, we're not completely yet. And I want to share a story from my chaplaincy training, which all of us have gone through as part of preparation for ordained ministry. And I was a hospital chaplain in a medical center about an hour north of New York City. And I was assigned to the maternity unit. And earlier in my life, I had suffered 2 ruptured ectopic pregnancies and was no longer able to bear children. And I thought I had healed from that painful reality, but I hadn't yet, and it took this particular case to help me really understand that. One of my patients was a 28-year-old black woman, single mom, mother of a 5-year-old boy and a 2-year-old girl. She'd been admitted to the hospital. It was a regional medical center, so it was high-risk pregnancies, not the garden variety maternity ward. And she suffered what medical professionals call a non-scheduled fetal demise. That's the medical jargon for her baby died at 23 weeks, and she had to go through labor and delivery. And so a few days later, when I was visiting her hospital room, I asked her, Jesus as my model, what would you like me to do for you today? And she asked me to open a box that, as she put it, had some of the baby's stuff in it. It was called a memory box. That was the term the nurses used, and it was in the bottom drawer of the table beside her bed. And the box was covered in that textured paper that has, seeds and ferns, and it was a very natural textured paper. And I lifted the top of the box off and shared it with her, and she said, "No, you take these things." And so she invited me to take out a blanket, a little pillow, a card that had the footprints of her daughter on it that had been signed by the doctors and nurses, and even a little cap. And she picked up the cap and offered it to me and said, "Do you smell her, Kate? Do you smell her?" And in that healing and most sacred moment, healing for me, healing for her, both my patient and I were wrapped in God's love. It was a sacred, sacred moment.
Beautiful.
Thank you for sharing that, Kate. I often think of 12-step programs when I think of healing, because in our churches, in many cases, 12-step programs occur, and we host them. COVID's been really tough for us at Grace because we haven't been able to safely host our usual AA group. And from time to time, I've been invited to AA groups just to listen or to walk with somebody. From time to time as a speaker. But I think of AA not from church, but from when I was a teenager, and I was invited to go to an AA in a fire hall in Winchester, downtown, a group that still meets today. And I remember the story of a man who had lost just about everything in his life. He lost his whole family in terms of relationships. And for him, he felt like everything had just been stripped away. And yet there was something about every person in that room in the presence of complete strangers that for him, by the end of that meeting, he felt like he could at least leave that meeting and walk out of there and not go and do the one thing that he didn't want to do, which was poison himself. And we all know folks who are in recovery, and one thing that I absolutely love about the 12-step program is that it names a higher power at the center of what it means to heal. That the substance or the thing we're addicted to is named in such a way that it no longer becomes God for us. It is no longer our God. But I often wonder when we're in church and we're praying and we're talking about God, and we're talking to God, perhaps, do we really understand God in the same way? We're all different. What sort of God are we imagining? In the case of this AA encounter, this God was very clear that was being named. It was a small g God, the kind of gods that Paul, the apostle, talks frequently about, the kind of gods that he encountered in his travels. What are some of those small g gods that get in the way of healing in your encounters as pastors or as healers?
I have I will confess to a bias and a pet peeve. And yet it's a delicate subject. I believe in this period in our life as a nation, we have gone way too far with individualism. I certainly believe I as an individual and you as individuals are unique, sacred, and distinct. But I also know, and I will only speak for myself, that I cannot do many things without support, assistance, and engagement with others. I think that's the genius of 12-step groups and the beauty of saying that we rely upon a higher power. And the beauty of saying a higher power as we each define it. So my concern is, and I believe the New Testament points us this way, I believe when we open ourselves to the healing power of God, that can only happen when we begin to stop listening to the voices in our heads that preoccupy us, including the voices that tell us that we're isolated from others. Or, I mean, it comes in various ways. People that have come to me for counseling of various kinds and have said something like, well, I bet you've never heard anything like this before, or I guess there's no one else out there that feels this way. People can feel so isolated. And yet we put ourselves, I believe, in these emotional prisons of individualism, and we feel we have to guard our individuality. It is no sacrifice of my individuality to say that there are times in my life when I need help and support. And the tragedy is, of all the people, three of us surely know, who would so readily be given help if only they would ask. If only they would ask. Healing in the New Testament sense, and Kate, this goes back to your wonderful comments, it begins with a few simple questions to establish a relationship. And it goes from there to create a new kind of social and spiritual bond based upon a in that sense, restored identity of the person.
Thank you.
I might add to that, when you talk about the small g God of individualism, embedded in that, I've experienced in my pastoral encounters the small g God of perfectionism.
Yes.
Which some would say is a mark of whiteness, and some have defined as such.
So, yes.
I think
The
so.
Protestant work ethic.
Yes, yes. And as we've experienced people coming to us, perhaps beginning a conversation with, I'm sure you've never heard this before, but this feeling that amongst some of the people we've encountered as pastors and pastoring to them, that they have to be perfect. They have to have all the answers. It is it takes a huge leap of faith for many people to even make the phone call, send the email, send the text to say, Bill, Weston, or Kate, may I have some of your time? And our culture is one that really is success-oriented, and that the small g God of perfectionism can really sneak in there like a devil seeking someone to devour. So I put perfectionism as a small g God.
I agree.
Yeah, you know, that is spot on for me too, Kate. I think back to when I first started in Richmond at St. Stephen's, and the last service of the spring was confirmation for youth and adults, and for the youth that were graduating high school, a name would be placed next to the college that they were attending. It was a very, to me, odd kind of signifier, because what that said was, your name is not enough. The signal about how perfect you are is just as important as your baptismal name. And I had a conversation with, kind of the clergy and with our youth minister who did not feel comfortable with it either, but it was a custom he inherited. This idea that in the bulletin it was printed out, such and such going to the University of Virginia, so-and-so going to Georgetown. And that was sort of the beginning of sort of going out into the world, that you had next to your baptized name, next to your name beloved, was this signifier. And that's often, it may seem like a small thing, but it begins there, and it never stops for some of us.
Well, and the other piece of that is the assumption that one would go to a 4-year college.
Right.
And there are plenty of people who find their joy in fulfilling a vocation that has nothing to do with what is called higher education.
Mm-hmm.
That's another
Right.
stigmatizer.
Yeah.
And, and honestly, I wish I'd had the courage at that point in my life not to leap from high school to college, but to take a year or two off and work, have some travel or some adventures. And, I think I would have gained a great deal if I had done that. And I have realized precisely what you're saying. And it goes back, Kate, to your comments about perfectionism, which I think are spot on. The expectations, frankly, in a place like Richmond, Virginia, and other parts of Virginia, the expectations that can be placed on young people in families in terms of what they will do. And back in the day, it was even where you would work, or, it's fine if it's a real vocational fit for a person. But the hurt and the harm and the sense of disorientation that accompanies a young person trying to respond to undue family pressure. Not every family is like this, of course, but there are enough instances of people really suffering under this kind of pressure. And we as clergy having seen it repeatedly. So yes, the signifier of a college is one instance.
Mm-hmm. I want to switch gears here in the time we have remaining left, but it has to do with healing. I'm thinking back to ancient Greece and this interesting story of the archetypal healer. Well before the person of Jesus of Nazareth was the man, the healing person, Asclepius, who legend has it, or myth has it, would invite people who were seeking to be healed into a cave-like place where they were to lay down, in a place that was carved out of rock. And they were to sort of lay down. This was well before Freud's couch and that whole Germanic tradition. It was the original sort of couch. And when a person would fall asleep before Asclepius, the healer, it was up to him when they woke up to have a conversation about, tell me what you dreamed about. Tell me what in that part of your life, that very important part of your life, where though you were asleep, you were alive and you're living and your body's working and your mind's working. Tell me about that. Tell me about your dreams, because for him, it was the source of healing and the source of understanding wounds, well before Freud and Jung and more modern day forms of healing along these lines. For you, Kate, and for you, Bill, in terms of dreams, what do you see as a dream for healing, either in congregation, could be in your own life, it could be in the life of someone you love who is, maybe would remain anonymous, could be for our country. But casting a vision or a dream, as Asclepius would listen to, person after person coming into the cave and the cutout, where people would lay down, listen.
Well, one thing I would suggest, Weston, would be openness. The ability to be open to whatever might be possible. And that means putting aside preconceived notions, expectations, and sometimes in conversations with family members or with parishioners, entering in those conversations with a posture of openness can be very, very difficult, very challenging. Because, in my experience, sometimes people think you have a preconceived notion about what they might offer. And so one feature I would suggest is being able to be open and being able to be vulnerable. Because unless we are vulnerable, and there are some aspects of our society that think that vulnerability is not a good thing, but unless one is open and vulnerable, healing can't take place.
So your dream or vision would be a greater individual and corporate sense of vulnerability that Brene Brown talks about.
Yes, and a
others.
community vulnerability. Yeah, yeah. Brene Brown is a good source. Yes.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. And Bill, a dream or a vision of healing?
Two things. My vision of healing is, first of all, really kind of taps the idea of what the miracles represent in the New Testament. And that is the unexpected or unanticipated. And the second is the message I want to give to people as often and as fervently as I can. And that is, you can do it. I think when